Okay, if everyone will take their seats so we may start. So we are ever so slightly behind time, but we have one last and very important section of this that we have to go to, and that is climate resilience and climate change. Now, it's a wider issue, really. This is a very wide issue, and I think probably an issue of great uncertainty for the future in Africa. That would be the issue of how to create a green, climate-resilient economy with sustainable, low-carbon development, and one that will also protect the natural resources of the African continent for Africa and for the future of the rest of us as well in the world. Now, we have two excellent speakers again for this topic. We have Mr. Dereje Agonafir from Ethiopia, who I'll introduce to you now, and his respondent will be Professor Padraig Carmody. Then we'll have another speaker who is a professor at Tracta Ingram. I will wait until we've dealt with climate before I introduce Professor Ingram, if that's all right. So we'll move along in that way. And the reason why we have transposed these speakers together is very particular. It's no accident at all. We felt that there was a lot to be said here about green economy and climate resilience, but that it really had to be in the context of a backdrop of human rights and the question whether human rights is doing what we need it to do in the context of development work and in the context of the future of Africa. So our next speaker, Mr. Dereje Agonafir, is the director of the Environmental Units Programme Directorate in the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Authority. He has been secured for us as a speaker by the very hard work of the Kenyan ambassador and also the Ethiopian ambassador, and we're very grateful to them for that. He represents the Environmental Protection Authority nationally and internationally and coordinates and monitors the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements to which Ethiopia is party. He has written and co-authored many publications in the realm of fisheries, management and the conservation of wetlands, including conserving wetland ecosystems for poverty eradication in the context of the Millennium Development Goals. He holds a BSc in biology from Addis Ababa and also an MSc in fisheries science from the University of Hull. In correspondence with Dereje in the last couple of days, we've had many chats, and as you will all know, I don't know that much about the details of climate change. But he, I think, really struck a chord with me because he said, the future of Africa lies not in the rise of Africa itself, but in the rise of Pan-Africanism and the renaissance that will be realised by the African nations working together to determine both common and differentiated responsibilities for climate change. He is an Ethiopian with a vision for his country of middle income status, but based on low carbon sustainable development. And that is a very, very high aspiration. His respondent then is Professor Padraig Carmody, who is a Trinity person through and through and a huge supporter of TIDI and of development and many projects across Africa. He lectures in geography at TCD, from where he has his BA from here, and also completed his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He's taught at the University of Vermont, in DCU, St. Patrick's. He is well known, I'm sure, to many of you in the development community, and he is well known for his policy and research analysis and for his work in combating poverty. His research centres on political economy of globalisation in Africa. He is editor-in-chief of Geoforum and has written widely on the new scramble for Africa. So with that, we will start with Dereje. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
The lights. Do you want lights or do you want... No, you're okay.
Can you put off the light, please?
Yes, sure. Absolutely. Here we go. No. No.
No, that one also.
The high one.
Leave this one, yeah.
Okay, you're right. Is it working for you?
Can you also check this one?
Sarah, help. Well, I tell you what, if you nod at me, we can...
The pointer.
Okay, all
Is it working now? It is the other. You just have to change it. It's working. Can you push forward? And backward. Sorry. Okay. I won the first slide, but it is okay. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Irish government, Trinity International Development Initiative, honorable ambassadors of the African countries, Your Excellency, Ms. Leilalem Gebre Johannes, and all others who have played great roles to organize this major historic event of Africa Rising Conference. Hence, as an African citizen, it gives me a great pleasure and honor to present a paper entitled Climate Resilient Green Development Initiative in Africa, the Experience of Ethiopia. The year 2013 has a lot of positive and beneficial implications, especially for African countries, because it marks the 15th anniversary of the OAU establishment. It also marks the 12th year of African Union formation, which has its own specific mission. Consequently, the heads of state and governments of the African Union has declared the year 2013 the year of Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. And this is the official logo for the year. Really, Africa is on the rise, as explained earlier, politically, economically, socially, and in terms of its demographic factors. And the continent is well aware of the challenges it faces and the available opportunities for realizing its renaissance. And one of the major challenges is climate change. Although Africa is, the contribution of Africa to climate change is minimal, the continent is being affected by the adverse impact of climate change brought by carbon-intensive development paths linked with fossil fuel use and land use changes. Especially land use changes has double implication in terms of aggravating the adverse impact of climate change by disturbing carbon cycle and releasing greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. Moreover, Africa is highly vulnerable to adverse impact of climate change because of various interlinked factors. And one of them is because of the low autonomous adaptive capacity of the continent, and the other is dominance of climate-sensitive sectors, and the third one is land degradation and desertification. There is also population pressure. Thus, economic development is important for income and job creation, it cannot be addressed independent of climate change risks and opportunities. Therefore, we need an adaptation measure to address climate change risks. We also need mitigation to reduce greenhouse gases and get related development co-benefits. Therefore, we need a climate-compatible development. As climate change is inevitable, we need to integrate economic development, adaptation, and mitigation so as to have sustainable development. Especially in Rio Plus 20 conference, the ministers of African countries have committed themselves by expressing the relevance of climate-compatible development as a means of enhancing sustainable development in Africa. And there are some initiatives on climate-resilient green economy activities in Africa, of which I'm going to present the experience of Ethiopia. According to the IMF forecast for the year 2011 to 2015. Ethiopia's economy will continue to grow at the third level internationally, following those of China and India. Indeed, Ethiopia's economy has been growing more than 10% for the last 9 years, except the current fiscal year, which has been reduced to 8.4. So we have achieved a remarkable results in our economic growth. Various studies has also shown, unless appropriate resilience action are taken, the GDP growth of Ethiopia would be affected between 0.5 to 5%. Therefore, cognizant of this fact, the government of Ethiopia has mainstreamed climate issues into its overall development plans, called a 5-year development plan, GTP, Growth and Transformation Plan. We have also set our vision, a CRGE vision, to become a middle income status country with a zero net emission by 2025. The rationale for preparing and implementing a climate resilient green economy strategy is fourfold. And one of them is, as a responsible nation and a party to the UNFCCC, Ethiopia wants to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions through reduced or avoided emissions and carbon sequestration. And the second one is the conventional development paths will lead to an overexploitation of natural resources. Hence, CRG is a necessity for Ethiopia to arrest the agro-ecological degradation and to sustainably use our biodiversity resources. By the way, Ethiopia is one of the centers and origins of biodiversity in the world. And the third one is to reduce the current physical requirements for the import of fossil fuels and to realize Ethiopia's huge potential in renewable energy, and this is an opportunity. And the third one is to avoid locking into imported technology. So the CRG encourages localization of technologies within the country. Regarding the institutional aspects of our CRGE preparation, overall implementation of the CRG preparation and its implementation. So there is a political dedication at the national level to realize the CRG implementation in the country, because our economy the growth of our economy cannot be addressed without addressing the issue of climate. Therefore, addressing CRG issue means it is addressing poverty, it is addressing sustainable development issue. Below that, there is a technical committee so as to have a coordinated and a synergistic approach among line ministries. And in line with the line ministries, there are sub-technical committees, and these sub-technical committees have a responsibility to ensure the sustainability of the initiative within their own ministry. So we have already established a CRGE unit within each ministry. And the other surprising thing is that we have already established a financial facility called, very recently, a CRGE facility. And it is housed under the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. We have also identified the thematic areas for our green economy strategy, and these are the 7 thematic areas for the development and the implementation of the green economy strategy, and they have been identified based on their capacity to release greenhouse gases, and so they have a mega share within the national economy. As you can see, during the base year, in 2010, the total annual emission of greenhouse gas emission was about 150 million tons of carbon dioxide, of which the agriculture and the forestry sector accounted about 87%, while the rest sectors constituted about 13%. If the economic development were to continue in a business as usual manner, the total annual emission would reach 400 million tons of carbon dioxide. Therefore, the implementation of the CRGE would reduce about 64% of the total emission in 2030. In addition to this, there are also other additional abatement potentials of about 19 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from exporting green power to the regional market. To this effect, the government of Ethiopia is working a lot of things with its neighboring countries. For instance, the governments of Djibouti and Sudan have already started to get a green power from Ethiopia. In addition to this, we have also very recently launched an Ethio-Kenya interconnection project regarding the hydropower. And this interconnection project will use a high transmission line, and also it will use the latest technology in Eastern Africa. In addition to exporting green power, we have also an interconnection project, especially railway with the Djibouti, plus we have also a water supply project for the Djibouti so as to address water issues in Djibouti. Therefore, generally, these are some of the indicative situation for developing a partnership with our neighboring countries. So it is an indication for our partnership building with our neighboring countries. And the other thing is, some of these initiatives are also an indicator for the rise of Africa to really realize its own renaissance at the continent level. Wow. These are the four main pillars of our green economy strategy, and one of them is the agricultural sector that comprises the livestock and the crop sector, and the second one is the forestry sector, and the third one is the power, and the last one is industry, transport, and buildings that uses advanced technologies to reduce a certain amount of green gases. And each pillars have their own potential to reduce significant amount of greenhouse gases, of which I will give you a brief explanation on the forestry sector. And this is the abatement cost curve for the forestry sector. The x-axis shows you the abatement potential of each abatement measures, and the y-axis shows you the amount of budget required to reduce 1 ton of carbon dioxide. From this initiative, one of them is the fuel wood efficient stoves, and government has planned to distribute about 9 million stoves, and this stove has a potential of reducing about 20% of emissions from the total emission. By the way, when I sent, it has been disturbed anyway, it is okay. Generally, these are the financial sources, and one of the sources is government budget. Government has already for instance, mainstreamed this initiative into the national ongoing initiative, and one of them is our growth and transformation plan. And secondly, especially during the current fiscal year, government has allocated 2% of the national budget to the environment sector to indicate its commitment to the CRGE initiative. And the second financial source is development partners. We have also got positive responses from our development partners. And third source is credited approach or international carbon finance mechanism. And there are also some ongoing initiatives. Finally, we have also established, as I said, a CRGE facility. And this is the CRGE facility. It indicates the supporters and the implementers of the CRGE, our climate resilient green economy initiative. So far, various stakeholders have responded, development partners have responded to our CRGE initiative, and some of them are Austria, Norway, UK, others, China, Japan, and the others have positively responded to our initiative. So we are progressing in a very good manner. And finally, in my conclusion, we have already set our vision. We have also prepared our green economy strategy. We have also set our climate resilient strategy, of which we have finalized our framework for adaptation, and we are also currently in the process of finalizing the detailed climate resilience investment, the detailed climate resilience strategy of the sectors. And then to implement the strategy at the grassroots level, we are currently preparing various investment plans and proposals, and so as to speed up the implementation of these plans and the proposal at the grassroots level, there are capacity building blocks such as coordination, finance, MRV, and knowledge management, so as to speed up the implementation of these plans and proposals at the grassroots level. And then finally, we will have our climate resilient green economy vision realized by 2025. And the CRG will have a key transition, and at the end of our vision, the contribution of agriculture to the, will decrease from 42% to 26%, and then there will be a migration of forces from agriculture to service in the industry. And finally, we will attain our middle income status country based on a zero net carbon emission. When I come to the OAU celebration, it is very clear that the 1963 founding generations have fulfilled their mission through liberating Africa from colonialism and apartheid, and by laying a strong foundation for solidarity and the unity of Africa. And then the current generation has also its own mission to build Africa that is integrated, prosperous, people-centered, and at peace with itself. Though there are various challenges at the regional level, there are also various opportunities to realize the mission of the African Union so as to build its renaissance. Thus, my message to the Irish government and all development partners is that to enhance the pace of the realization of the African renaissance, development partners and all concerned stakeholders have to join their hands with the African Union in all possible matters that lie ahead for the benefit of the whole humanity in general. That is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassadors, members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Dereje for his great insights into Ethiopia's green economy strategy. I think it's quite inspiring to see a detailed practical plan and a vision of how to achieve a carbon neutral economy in a fast-growing African country. So Vinay was saying earlier that the function of a respondent is to be a little provocative, so I hope I can achieve that. I'll leave it to you to judge whether I do or not. I think many of us might agree that Africa is rising, but that begs the question, what is Africa rising towards? Is it rising towards the levels of overdevelopment in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, or is the continent empowered to chart its own course to development? Who will control that destiny, and what will the outcome look like? If we're thinking specifically about green economy, the questions we need to ask for Africa are very different from those that we might ask for a country like Ireland. Arguably, much of Africa already has a green economy. with a few exceptions like South Africa, which is one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters. But most countries in Africa already have a green economy. If you look at Ireland, we exceed our ecological footprint by a factor of about 3. Okay, so we'd need 3 planets if everyone was to consume at Irish levels. That's not the case for countries like Ethiopia, which are living within their ecological footprint. So Ethiopia already has a green economy. So this leads us to ask a different set of questions. Often in the media we hear about the need for Africa to change, to be more like Europe, to develop. But there's value in maintaining the positive aspects of African development. And surely building on what is already in place is potentially a more progressive strategy than attempting to replicate the experience of other regions around the world, which may not be appropriate to the current conjuncture. So the question, if we pose it in that frame, is how to raise the welfare payoffs and impacts from economies in Africa while maintaining their green economy status. Now, the traditional model has been of development to pursue economic growth. And once a certain level of economic income output has been achieved, for governments to redistribute the fruits of that income, to redistribute income. But increasingly, we need to question that approach to development. There are questions about the environmental impacts of untrammeled, unregulated economic growth. There are questions about the social sustainability of growth which is not inclusive, which generates inequalities. And also, according to some studies, the decoupling of happiness from income beyond certain threshold levels. Now, if we pose the question of how to maintain low-carbon economies but improve welfare outcomes, what kind of questions should we be thinking about or asking? First question I think we should, or consider at least, is it possible to harness and invest current, often natural resource intensive growth into building environmentally friendly, sustainable infrastructures and industries? Can we capture some of the benefits of the current round of globalization and invest them differently and productively to structurally transform African economies onto sustainable but welfare-enhancing growth paths? What does that mean in terms of the relative balance between export orientation and domestic orientation for economies? Does the development of environmentally friendly industries imply a greater focus on domestic and local markets than hitherto? If so, what sort of reforms of the global trade regime are required to facilitate technology transfer and diffusion combined with domestic market deepening? Now, Mr. Dereje spoke about the need for climate resilient development. And that's critically important given that the majority of people in Africa earn their livelihood from agriculture. If we're thinking about agriculture, what kinds of low external input technologies are available that are climate resilient and labour absorptive? How can those be used to synergize with locally adapted knowledges about how to raise output and reduce risk? Now, as I said already, we often think when we're talking about African development about the necessity for change. Africa is presented as needing development. While that's true to some extent, I want to finish by arguing that we do need to build on existing institutions, practices and infrastructures if we're to chart a green economy which diversifies African economies into the future. Thank you.
And there you have it again, 2 speakers, both masters and experts in their own area, but with very slightly different but transposing views on how things should be. And it's always a great delight to hear that in reality, in practice, so thank you to you both. Before we move to our question and answer session, we have one more important perspective to consider. And this is, I think, a very, perhaps maybe the basis for everything that we have to consider in the future. And that is really that in thinking about an Africa that is rising, we have to ensure that we do that in the context of the rise of nationhood and statehood and the rise of constitutional patriotism. And that we also look at what perhaps was the traditional approaches to rights, the traditional human rights-based approach to actions, and see whether they are now require adaptation for a new world and for a new future. And so it was with great delight then that we ask an expert in this area to come and speak for us, and that is Professor Attracta Ingram. Now, Professor Ingram is a UCD graduate. We're delighted for that because we have great links with UCD. We've in fact had many of our most productive relationships have been with other academics in UCD. I'm thinking particularly of herself and Professor Walsh. But we are delighted to say she has a PhD from Trinity. So this gives her double value, top points. So we're delighted to have her come and speak for us today. She's a professor in politics and political science from UCD. She's published extensively on political and social theory, and particularly on the philosophy of rights, social justice, pluralism, nationhood, statehood, and patriotism and cosmopolitanism. She's been elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy and is founder and board member of the European Inter-University Centre for Human Rights and Democratisation. She's held the Jean Monnet Research Fellowship, as well as being a visiting fellow to St Andrews, Harvard, Columbia and Berkeley. And I think it is a very... we've heard an awful lot today. We've heard momentum and forward movement and potential and opportunity. But it's very important that when we come to the end and we draw our conclusions, that we do so with a degree of introspection. And I hope that Professor Ingram will provide us with that. Thank you.
I didn't quite know who that introduction was for, because it's sure not for me. It's very scary to be introduced as an expert, I tell you. What I'm going to do today is something very simple, though I think it might be controversial in its implications. First of all, you've heard a bit about who I am. I just want to add that I'm a moral and political philosopher, so I don't really get down and dirty as much as I'd like in the area of either human rights or development. I'm basically an educationalist. My main practical affiliation, as Martina said, is with the EU-funded European Inter-University Centre for Human Rights, of which I was a founding member. And I mention that because the EU now funds human rights education programs in all 5 continents. My contribution today is, I hope, to raise some questions about rights-based development, in particular what we can and cannot perhaps expect of adding human rights to development in what became very popular as a rights-based approach to development. This became a new paradigm which was given a lot of impetus, particularly in the noughties, the early noughties, as they're called. And the first thing about that paradigm is that it's a matter of brand association between human rights and development, which is done well for both of those previously separate disciplines. And part of it, that brand association, was about garnering moral prestige, something that cut both ways. The human rights people wanted the content that is given by development, and development wanted, the assurance of being in a kind of ethical space. And I wanted to just give one quote, first of all, about this notion of moral prestige, because I'll come back to it when I mention San in a few moments. I think we should be very clear what we're talking about, or seem to be talking about, when we're talking about human rights, just the very idea. And I'm going to give you a little quote from Louis Henkin, who's a very famous legal theorist in the United States. And he says, and this is followed by everyone really, implicit in the idea of human rights is a commitment to individual worth. The individual counts and counts independently of the community. The idea suggests equality of human beings, not hierarchy among them. So it's very simple but very powerful, but perhaps controversial for some people too. Now this idea was felt in that brand association model to be part of the motivation that actually had so many people working for human rights and development, but working in particular in the human rights arena. It was also a way of introducing ethical and political dimensions to aid and trade without mentioning politics. In 2004, some of you will know an article written by Amartya Sen called Elements of a New Theory of Human Rights. And when I first came across that, I wondered why a new theory was needed, because moral and political philosophers had been writing theories for at least 3 centuries. And in the 70s and especially the 80s, there was an immense amount of theorizing going on in moral and political philosophy. It was almost completely taken over by theorizing about human rights. And all the available theoretical possibilities were worked out very quickly with legal theorists. I mean, the philosophers worked with the legal theorists who were also philosophers. So that there was a lot going on. So I thought, why is this economist suddenly telling us that we need yet another theory? And he was. And those of you who've read it will know that it's very clear, very well laid out, and calls for clarity from the philosophers, and points out that there is still a certain kind of fuzziness about rights. And what was interesting when I began to look at the article again was that Sen wanted to talk about the human rights idea as an idea about moral rights. And the philosophers had almost given up on that under pressure, argumentative pressure of a sound kind from the legal theorists, most of which were positivists. You know, rights are real if they come from law and not otherwise. So the philosophers weren't talking very much at all about moral rights, except in one very powerful tradition, which was the Kantian tradition. Sen wanted to re-energize that debate about the possibilities of debate about moral rights for a particular reason. He felt that he wanted to address the NGOs, not really the philosophers, and the energy of the NGO activists who could do a better job than government in reaching into the worlds of the poor in particular. So he was developing a rights-based strategy, though we didn't quite know it, that was addressed primarily to NGOs. Now, the evidence for the success of this strategy on the ground is, I would think, not yet in. That is for the rights-based strategy, and perhaps I will tell you some reasons why later on. But Sen did understand one very crucial point, and that is that the theory we need is best developed in response to practical problems, not some alleged truth we draw down from the sky and apply. So I want to frame my discussion in that more practical way. Development issues, I think most people would think of as matters for what philosophers call practical reason. Questions about what is to be done are the domain of practical reason, rather than what is true, which is the domain of theoretical reason. What is true and relevant to development and to the social and global justice concerns that philosophers write about is something actually very simple. It's that people anywhere and everywhere have some capacity to think about what they want in their own lives, what they need to survive and flourish, what will make them happy in that Aristotelian sense, and also some capacity to recognize that others have those capacities and desires too. And if any of us is to get what we want, we have to have some shared rules of conduct. Now, this is a view that philosophers grandly call a moral personality, a common moral personality which identifies and pursues some idea of the good and gives justice to others. And in talking about that, we're talking about natural capacities, not a matter of Western moral imperialism, and not something that is sanctimonious or whatever. It's a kind of morality naturalized. So I want to say in this way of looking at things that human rights are products of practical reason, though they are often, as we know, thought to be about moral truth. We get this description of them very evidently in the original American Declaration of Independence, which I slightly misquote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there is the kind of what I call the top-down cognitive truth view. Now, in Europe, it's very different. Of course, Europe had a natural law and religious tradition also. But in the declarations, that wasn't mentioned. The declarations are very different in the European case. And the reason is that there were different problems. They weren't looking really for intellectual truths. They were looking for ways of solving problems. So in Europe, the form of declarations tended to be something like, we declare, we decide. It's not laid out for us in advance. So the job of philosophers in this European tradition, and indeed quite generally, is to provide a universally shareable, rational defense of some idea of what is right in the world, of answers to questions about practical problems or questions about what to do. Those answers are not indisputable, they're not self-evident, they're not certain, and they are revisable. So the certainty of the truths that are in the American Declaration just isn't going to be there. They're revisable for lots of reasons, including the fact that rights-based philosophy is not the only approach in the field. There's utilitarianism and there's virtue ethics. They offer rival approaches to the question of what is right. And the question about them is not are they wrong or whatever, but can they address the practical problem that human rights is supposed to address, which changes in time, of course. So my fundamental outlook here is to ask always, what is the problem to which human rights is the solution? And what evidence is there that human rights is the solution? I met a former student recently who said to me that he had attended a course I used to give on law, politics, and human rights, and he'd come fresh from working for many years in Amnesty, thinking that he'd have a kind of a bit of a look at the background for this. And he said, I came out of your class and my whole life had changed. because you had just completely debunked everything I was doing, and I didn't like that. And he said, you took an hour and spoke to me. I didn't remember this, fortunately, because, of course, I wasn't debunking the NGOs, but I was suggesting, of course, something about not letting human rights develop into an ideology, just because it sounds moral or something like that. It's much better and more useful to see it as suited to the coordination problems that we have as human beings. So what I'm saying implies that the way to think about human rights is not as inherent in men and women, despite the UN Declaration. It's not like DNA inherent. It's not like having tonsils or organs, only a lot spookier. And this was the point that Sen picked up too, that and many others, the inherent human rights do seem a bit spooky, like where are they, or how do we get access to them, and so on. So in my naturalized version, that's gone. Human rights, in the first instance, I suggest, are simply ways of saying what is right and wrong for governments to do. Now that's a little bit different from what Sen wants them to do. His audience is different. I'm saying human rights are very close to the constraint of governments. Why? Because government comes into the picture pretty early in the logical genealogy of rights because of what a right is. And in very simple terms, a right is a justified claim to use force or the threat of force to restrict the freedom of another. So when talk of rights is in the air, when rights are in the air, so is force. In the absence of government, force, rights, the natural rights we used to talk about 3 centuries ago, turn into feuding, revenge, and incessant war. I'm not saying governments are not responsible for a lot of this, but bear with me. In the European narrative, government itself has to be restrained if it's to fulfill its function. So we have to develop a very powerful narrative of what is right and wrong for government to do. And natural moral rights are part of that original narrative. In a world without acceptable government, the original European narrative would justify force by appeal to the shared moral sense of Judeo-Christian culture, though that was often cloaked in the language of shared rationality. But you still get that in Locke, for example, though not in the more robust arguments of Hobbes. But the real problem that those philosophers, and particularly Locke and those who came after him, had to address was to replace absolute power, allegedly sanctioned by divine authority, by a system of limited government, accountable in some way to the people. Why is this a solution people want? They were not raving Democrats in the 17th century, let me tell you. But divine rule and absolute power had to go because of the religious wars that were associated with it, wars that ruined the life, security, and prosperity of Europe. So the difference between the European and the American case was that there were religious wars that were going on for a great length of time, and that couldn't be resolved because nobody could convince the other side that their version of religious truth was right. So the solution to the wars of religion takes rights eventually in a new direction that is germane for us. Religion is separated from the state and occupies the Aristotelian ethical space for human flourishing, while morality comes under the aegis of the citizen state and of those relations, the arena in which people can live the way they want as long as they allow others to do likewise. So we have historically room then for a principle of toleration, and also a need for rights to belong to citizens as individuals. For the individuals, not the group, are those who have to participate in rule if groups are not to dominate each other all over again in the state. So far, so very Greek. Some of you will know that these ideas go back to the original Greek. So this idea that I read to you earlier from Henkin about the equal worth of individuals is not just a matter of ideology. It was necessary to have an identity as citizen that separates individuals from the groups that cause trouble in society, essentially. That bit of what's often regarded as Western ideology, anti-communitarian and so on, actually had that function and probably still has that function. So this is a cropped version, as they say on Facebook, of a long and more complex story. But it is the frame for the next point I want to make about rights. In the civic public world, rights are not based on religion or rational intuition or a doctrine of inherence. So the fuzzy stuff has to go. The source is the law we give ourselves. As Bentham says, from real laws come real rights, and he says some more interesting things as well. From imaginary laws of nature, we only get imaginary rights. And we have to give each other rights and obligations through law precisely so that we can tell the guys with the big sticks, the government, what is right and wrong for it to do. Talk of human rights on this view is going to be government talk, because in the final analysis, only government can deliver the law that delivers the rights. There is more to the realization of rights, of course. We know empirically that law alone does not deliver rights to those who need them. The poor may not even take much interest in rights and democracy, as was said in the case of Malawi some years ago. There is a backstory of moral rights that I'm leaving out here, and to that extent, Sen is correct in describing the idea of human rights as moral rights. But moral rights, too, I suggest, are a matter of law, a moral law that we give ourselves, though, in agreement. And there is a deep story about that in the philosophy of Kant, which I'm going to spare you because you wouldn't be able for your lunch if you had that. But that is the Kantian strand that survives to defend a moral rights view. And not because it is a truth of reason, but because it is the theory that addresses the general form that practical problems of what to do take. But there are a couple of points that I want to just drag out of the deep story. In the human rights world, or a human rights world, if we are going to subject ourselves to law, it has to be the law we make ourselves. There's a point from both Rousseau and Kant that is the harbinger of democracy nearly 3 centuries later, an unfulfilled goal on a global scale. A related point is that this natural capacity to make and live by law is what gives humanity its special status or dignity. There's nothing mysterious or sanctimonious about human dignity. It's just, on this view, a special natural capacity that we alone among the animal species have, and that we can take pride in as humans. The capacity to make the law, to live by law, but to make the law for ourselves. That is also connected to a third point, which is a parsimonious one. In Kant and others, there is only one human right, the right of all to be free, both in the sense of freedom from interference and in the sense of positive freedom or autonomy, which is the freedom to make the law we live by. And that theme is taken up in Sen on freedom and also in a positivist-like heart. So moral rights, in the plural, on this account, are specifications of that dual freedom. And what that means is that all the rights in the system must hang together as enabling for one or both of those freedoms. So if we take economic and social rights, for example, and cultural rights, the argument for those has to be something like these rights are required to ensure the equal worth of other rights like civil and political rights. Because civil and political rights on this view of the genealogy of rights are central to being a rights bearer at all. So moral rights, which I'm bringing back in a little bit, I regard as the children of philosophers and moralists, with smaller families of rights preferred, and they are nurtured and groomed and grown, ready for transition into legal rights, into a rule of law world. So my next point is that the important point for rights-based development is cultivation of the rule of law, and of self-made law at that. There can be development, as we know, for some, without the rule of law as we understand it, but that is a life that is insecure, as in Hobbes' state of nature. And from following very quickly from that is the idea that access to law for the poor requires education and the possibility of independent existence. Aid can feed, trade can raise possibilities of choice, problem solving, innovation and creativity. But what human dignity requires is something that I call franchise, secure freedom to feed oneself, to enjoy a fair share in the benefits of collective life. So in sum, I want to say that human rights have a long-range trajectory that involves governments as well as NGOs. And the split between government and NGOs that is often very evident, and to the advantage of NGOs and to the advantage of governments who can't do business with some countries, that split really has to be translated into partnership of a political and social kind as well as an international kind. And we heard a little bit about that idea from the Minister earlier. So I'm running out. I've overstepped my time, so thank you very much.
Very good. So we come almost to the close, but we have some questions. And I think when you think of your questions, you start back at the beginning and where we started this morning. So we had health transposed against the need to develop intellectual capital. We've had economics transposed with the need to take responsibility for social justice and impact. We've had the green economy and climate resilience transposed against the need to develop a philosophy around rights that is for everyone, that is developed not just by governments, not just by NGOs. And we've had the need to consider what it is that Africa is rising towards, because we are seriously very connected to what happens to Africa happens to the rest of us. So the connectivity is there, and we can, I think, just about have time to take a couple of questions before we come to the ambassador from Lesotho and a couple of closing remarks. Well, yeah.
Yes, Peter Simons, Professor of Philosophy at Trinity. To what extent is the current economic upturn in Africa connected to economic activities other than the exploitation of natural resources? Because I think moving away from that is key to securing long-term economic growth.
Who would like to take that? Yeah, okay, please do.
Thank you very much for your comment. generally, as we see, the world, most of the countries that have a highest economic growth falls under, the countries of African continent. The reason is that there is a high potential of untapped natural resources. Therefore, the economic turn, if it is well managed, will continue in a very sustainable way. So there is a positive progress towards that. But to maintain this economic growth in a positive way, we need to address, the climate issues in a policy and a systematic way by addressing or by implementing appropriate actions at the grassroots level. Because without acting at the grassroots level, we cannot maintain this economic growth and upturn for the future. Thank you.
So there's been some studies done recently on this. McKinsey's a few years ago, I think it was, had a report called Lions on the Move, where they said there's more to the African growth story than natural resources. And if you look at services, that they've been key drivers of growth. I guess, however, though, if we're thinking about the role of natural resource exports, one of the things that they've done is they've unlocked the foreign exchange constraint for African economies. So if you had capacity utilization issues in manufacturing, for example, where people couldn't buy spare parts or get raw material inputs because they had to be imported, the natural resource exports facilitate improved capacity utilization and are important drivers of growth in their own respect as well.
My question is to what you alluded to earlier on that African countries already have green economies. But having read your book, I was just trying to maybe get a comment from you. What do you think about the current Chinese investments in Africa and their non-green credentials? Do you think then there's a trend that they might reverse what Africa already has in terms of the green credentials? Thank you.
So good point. I think, as I mentioned, a lot of growth in Africa is natural resource intensive, which is inherently unsustainable. So I think African governments need to be thinking about capturing, harvesting, investing that growth for the future and structurally transforming economies onto a greener growth path. Now, there are a number of contradictions of African economic development associated with natural resource exploitation. The first one is the unsustainability. The second one is that if you're thinking about oil exports, for example, so perhaps Nigeria has a green economy if we're thinking about it living within its carbon budget. Okay, so we can put it in that frame, but it's exporting masses of oil and contributing to an unsustainable economy globally. So there are these contradictions and tensions, and we need to be aware of how African political economies are integrated into the global system. And one of the things I was again intimating or trying to intimate in my response was the need to reform the global trade regime so that there's less pressure put on countries to export natural resources in an unsustainable way, which, as you rightly kind of intimated, is very problematic.
Last one there.
Okay, right. Thank you. Adekunle Gomez from the African Cultural Project. I've been trying to kind of link in today's session with the theme of the 50 years. And just thinking of where we came from, it just happened that this year, Scotland and Southern Africa is marking 200 years of the arrival of David Livingstone, who, as we know, he came up with the concept of the 3 C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Never mind that Christianity was in Africa 100 years before some countries in Europe, which is Ethiopia. Then his time there was followed by the explorers and of course the Berlin Conference, which we have to remember. Now, down the line, when some of the countries achieved independence, we were then trying to see how we can move forward, hence the OAU's charter. Now, some people were not happy about that part of the constitution, which was talking about respecting borders. But I thought, well, personally, I thought it was a good thing. That then was followed by, if you like, the various forms of government, and we know the problems we've had. With regard to the economics, just coming to the question now, and Podrick, I was delighted I was interested when you said about, where you questioned whether it's going to be, whether it's a green aspect to it. Now, I'm aware that in Europe, there is, if you like, differences between the green economics as passed by Schumacher, and then the bigger, if you like, investment. So I was wondering, how do we in Africa cope with the competing views presented by Europe, if we are to see that as an example? Thank you.
Okay, so I think, again, to kind of reverse things a little bit, I think one of the questions we need to ask is, what does Europe need to learn from Africa? If we're in this together, if we want one world living, if we want to live on a sustainable planet, and we're going to have to do that if we want to survive future generations, what do we need to learn from Africa? And I think one of the inescapable lessons of African development for Europe is the imperative and necessity of reducing consumption. Yes, green technologies can help us achieve a carbon neutral future, but we also need to reduce our consumption, and I think that's an inescapable fact. So, you raise a very important point here, which is perhaps the European Union in its new development and aid overseas development assistance strategies is promoting green technology and so on, but is without really addressing that kind of elephant in the room, if you like. And what are the power relations and the financial flows which undergird those to enable African countries to chart a different course which is more sustainable and has better welfare impacts and outcomes?
Okay, and lastly, can I just ask, I'm very struck by the resonance that occurs between what Attracta has to say and what Vinay had to say. So there's a lot, would seem to me, in common there about with concepts of dignity and choice. And I'm very struck by what you said about making laws for yourselves, for the future. But can you make a comment for me about how that fits with the kind of momentum and the speed at which Africa is developing? Attracta.
I think that, sorry, thank you. I think that we've been very slow to want to lecture either Africa or other countries about human rights. Now, politicians do on their trade missions sometimes lecture, and I get quite a bad press for it. But I think we need to get beyond the idea that we've done something important if we lecture. We need to do something else. I'm not sure what it is that would actually work on the ground, but we need education that is sensitive to where people are coming from, but is sensitive to the ways in which we can empower people, and that also actually does bring people from thinking that the best they can do for themselves is work out how to live as best they can in a village economy or whatever, but have the aspiration to actually begin those leadership roles at higher level. And I know work is being done on that, and there was some discussion of leadership and so on. And I think that's one strategy, but there are always others that could be done.
So we come to the end, and thank you very much for staying with us. And we still want to hear from the ambassador from Lesotho, but I'm going to sign off from the Trinity side. And before I do, I want to make a couple of comments and say thank you to lots of people. I want to make a comment really that one of the great strengths of TIDI is it's a small and nimble organisation, but the great strength of it is that we seem to be very lucky with the speakers that we get every time. We get people who come to us with commitment and mastery and expertise and scholarship. And almost invariably, when you put that potent mix together, we get interesting questions and great transposition of information. And I think on this particular occasion, what we normally do has been very much enriched by the input from the ambassadors in finding what they felt were the right people to tell the story. And we're very grateful, particularly to the ambassador from Kenya, Dr. Soyingbe, and also the ambassador from Ethiopia for securing us such spectacular speakers. We've been very lucky to hear that kind of rich thinking and multiply layered thinking around the rise of Africa. I also want to thank our other speakers, Dr. Dereje from Ethiopia, Porig, Attracta Ingram. I want to thank also Vinay and Adrian Hill, who's now gone back, and of course Minister Costello. I also very much want to thank the rest of the TIDI steering group, Carol, Susan for minding people, Porig for minding people, Helen for helping, Sarah for wonderful, wonderful work, Jenna, our super intern from Deakin, and also Dawn most recently. And thank you very much for coming and for attending and for being with TIDI throughout this year as we've discussed a great many things. So we have come almost to the end of our year, and we will be back again, I promise you, in September with a great many other events, and I hope they'll all be as rich and as good as this one. We are here, don't forget, to celebrate African Union and 50 years of the African Union and 50 years of African Rising and another century to go of Africa Rising. I've been very struck by the complete lack of cynicism that I see around the room and how wonderful it is to see great momentum and progress. So we've heard all about inspiring stories, I think, across health, economics and climate. And what they have reminded me of is that we are so very interconnected. It's not just about what the countries within the African continent, but also about the relationship between Africa and the countries outside the African continent. And as you rise, so will we, I think. So I thought I would leave you perhaps, for me signing off from Trinity and from TIDI for this year, I'd like to leave you perhaps just with two quotes, because it's not our day. And so I couldn't really leave you with an Irish concept. I thought I'd better leave you with a couple of African concepts, really. And the two quotes are, one probably very overused from Mandela: "I dream of the realisation of the unity of Africa, whereby its leaders combine in their efforts to solve the problems of this continent. I dream of the vast deserts, the forests, and our great wilderness. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same." And this is what I mean about the interconnectedness between your rise and ours. And the last quote I will give you is from a lady called Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the first African-American winner of a Pulitzer Prize. She was born in 1917, a very long time ago. And she said in relation to Africa, she said, "Our stories are singular, but our destiny shared. We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond. God bless Africa, guard her people, guide her leaders, and may she have peace and prosperity." And with that, I wish you a very happy African Day. I beg your pardon, I've been a very poor host. I forgot to mention Wele from Citibank, who gave us such an outstanding contribution in relation to the growth of the African economy. So I'll now hand you over to the ambassador from the Kingdom of Lesotho, Mr. Famatoze, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Martina Hennessy. Perhaps I should, at the risk of standing between the Irish Lions and their Springbok, their lunch, let me salute my colleagues, excellencies, heads of diplomatic missions, eminent panelists and speakers who we have listened to today, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of my colleagues, heads of African diplomatic missions accredited to Ireland, let me extend my sincere gratitude to the Trinity International Development Initiative for hosting this auspicious conference here today. I would also wish to thank Minister Joe Costello, who made his contribution earlier today by means of an opening address. I would like to acknowledge and commend the speakers and discussants for their intellectual and incisive inputs into the issues that are most critical to the development of Africa and have been not only thought-provoking, but indeed evoking a paradigm shift about the development of our continent and its people. I would also like to acknowledge you, the audience, who have throughout the day not just attended the conference, but also engaged with the issues that have been raised. Program Director, the opportunity presented by conferences like the one that we have had here today to reflect on the eventful past 50 years since 1963 in Africa and its prospects in the next 50 years up to 2063 can only add to the body of knowledge that will assist all of us to sharpen and focus our resolve and remove myths about the continent. When, on the 25th of May 1963, the visionary leaders of Africa signed the pact that formed the Organization of African Unity, and many more leaders attached their endorsement of the same in subsequent years, they acknowledged that the fate of the African continent and its people was Pan-Africanist in nature, which means that the total liberation of Africa from its vices can only be fast-tracked when Africans act in unison. By and large, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, dictatorships, and human self-should have been relegated to history. The need for more vigilance and decisive leadership to ensure that they remain only in the annals of history is upon us. The current leadership has undertaken to lead African people out of the clutches of poverty, disease, fear, and deprivation. While much has been achieved in this regard, mistakes have been made, lessons have been learned, and ideals have been revised. We still have some way to go. At last, there is a clear and tangible progress in Africa, in all spheres of life. The continent is more peaceful than it has ever been in hundreds of years. African economies are growing fast. Democracy has taken root on both sides of the Sahara. People of African ancestry in the diaspora are representing the continent with distinction. Africa is truly on the rise. We need acceleration on this course. We are grateful to all the true friends of Africa, such as the people of Ireland who are committed to staying the course with us despite their own challenges. One of the key achievements of the past 50 years of the African independence, which was highlighted in this conference, has been the affirmation of the ability of the African people to excel in any endeavor that they undertake. Africans on the continent and in the diaspora have, in the past half-century, proven over and over and over again that given a chance, they are able to govern themselves and others, to master the complexities of God's creation in the natural sciences, to fight for peace, to love, to play as well as anyone else. The excellence of African people has restored and established the African pride. As we take stock of achievements in the global agenda for development under the umbrella of the Millennium Development Goals, we acknowledge the need to review the baseline for Africa in that agenda in the subsequent decades. That is beyond 2015. We all have to engage in the definition, bringing into focus the issues discussed today as they apply to Africa, especially the issues of health, nutrition, climate change, and the promotion of fair trade with and within Africa. The intricate relationship between climate change, food security, nutrition, and health are aptly highlighted, or rather were aptly highlighted in a recent conference on hunger, nutrition, and climate justice co-hosted by Irish Aid, the World Food Programme, and the Mary Robinson Foundation in the Dublin Castle in April. The new paradigm in this regard is the acknowledgement that smallholding farmers in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world have been aware of the interrelationships including the innovations on how to successfully tackle these challenges. With regards to development aid, in spite of the never-ending debate about its pros and cons for sustainable development in Africa, the fact is that many lives have been saved and many more have been changed forever through the assistance such as that offered by the Irish people through Irish Aid. It is for this reason that we acknowledge with appreciation the recent launch by the Government of Ireland of its policy for international development titled One World, One Future, the Ireland's policy on international development. While we believe that such aid will continue to be needed in some countries, or at least some communities in Africa for a while longer, it is sometimes worrying that in a noble attempt by some aid agencies to keep European citizens interested and generous in their donations to support aid initiatives, by highlighting how much need is still out there, they tend to underplay the success that they have already achieved in the past interventions. I believe that stopping for a moment to look back and celebrate success is essential for both the donors and the beneficiaries' communities. As African heads of missions accredited to Ireland, we appreciate another paradigm shift in the strategy on Africa adopted by the Government of Ireland from September 2011, which embraces the need for Ireland to include in its engagement with Africa the promotion of mutually beneficial trade and investment. This recognition that aid and trade are not mutually exclusive is one which we have to underscore as progressive and endeavor to bring it to fruition in the coming years. There is an emerging crop of Irish businesses that are joining their counterparts from elsewhere in Europe to explore and develop ethical economic opportunities that assist sustainable development in Africa. We are actively engaging in this trend. Program Director, I would like to end by echoing the words that were said aptly by my brother here, Mr. Dereje, Habtewold. I couldn't have put it better, so I would quote him word for word. The mission of the present generation of Africa is to build on Africa that is integrated, prosperous, people-centered, and at peace with itself. End of quote. Again, thank you all very much for attending and for your inputs. Hope you enjoy the activities over this weekend to mark the 50th anniversary of the African Union. Otherwise, see you all in 2063. Thank you very much.